Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sustainable manufacturing is the creation of manufactured products through economically sound process that minimize negative environmental impacts while conserving energy and natural resources. Sustainable manufacturing also enhances employee community and product safety. And also, it is very cost effective. By improving the efficiency of equipment and processes, we can lower energy consumption, decrease manufacturing time, reduce waste, and use less material, all of which can provide significant cost saving. Global apparel industry has bitterly evidenced the social and environmental implications associated with fast production cycle or use of resources, waste generation, environmental pollution, and unethical labor conditions. Growing consumer awareness regarding the social and environmental impacts of fashion products has led to create a new marketplace for sustainable and ethical products. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my immense pleasure to welcome you all for the second Green Talk of the year 2020 regarding the sustainable manufacturing, a perspective from the apparel industry. To start off the session, I would like to introduce our environmental assertive speaker, Ms. Nadia Buhary. She is a former sustainability lead for a leading apparel manufacturer in Sri Lanka. And she has experience in the area of corporate sustainability, sustainability communications, and ESG reporting. A certified project management professional, she is passionate about developing sustainable solutions to mitigate the impact of business operations on the environment and has led critical projects such as elimination of PET usage, zero discharge of hazardous chemical, and net zero carbon buildings for the apparel industry. Ms. Nadia possesses a double degree in environmental management and biotechnology from Monash University and is currently pursuing a master's in sustainable resource management. With that, I would like to remind few housekeeping rules. First, please switch off your mics and cameras during the session. And if you have any questions, please be kind enough to put them in the chat box. Over to you, Ms. Nadia.
Thank you, Sitamini and the GBSL team. I'm going to keep this lecture a little a more visual experience and a little more interactive because I know everyone's at the end of the working day. So let me just share my screen. So today I'm going to be speaking about the importance and the business case for sustainable manufacturing and using some of my experience from the apparel sector to provide those insights. So I'm just kind of going to look at it in three different aspects, give a very brief introduction into the links between sustainability and industrialization, set the business case for sustainable manufacturing, look at how sustainable manufacturing can be achieved, what are the pros and the cons and the barriers that most companies and organizations face, and then we can go into a Q&A so that it's a bit more interactive. So I think we're all well aware and we've heard so much about global warming with all of the environmental conferences that have happened, especially with the recent one this year, earlier last year in UK. And we're all trying to achieve this, keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this graph is actually an analysis that was done by BBC following the summit. And what they say and what they see is that the current policies that are in place, not just in the UK, but globally, is not going to help us achieve that 1.5 degree target. So what they say is we're looking at temperatures being 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius, which is far above what we want to achieve. And there's a lot of pledges and targets that have come into place by organizations, by companies, countries and cities globally. And that still brings us to about 1.9, 2.1. So there's a lot more work that has to be done if we are to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'll explain why the industrial sector, especially the manufacturing sector, plays a key role in this. So I think if you just look at some of these impacts of global warming, and I've kept this a little more relevant to Sri Lanka, of course, except for the melting polar ice caps. But of course, melting polar ice caps will also impact sea level rise. And as an island nation, we are one of those at priority risk by that increase as well. We're looking at a lot more extreme weather. I think currently Sri Lanka is already in the midst of a drought. We're looking at a lot more heavier floods, prolonged drought periods. And as you can see from this image, that's actually one of our key highways completely inundated with water. Below, you can see poor air quality caused by haze and smog, and this isn't too far away. This is actually New Delhi. And the bottom middle picture is actually the Kalini River, which suffers from horrible river health and water quality. And that's very much so because of industrial pollution that comes in because it borders two key industrial zones, Sitawaka and Biagama, and also loss of habitat. So we're going to see a lot more deforestation happening, a lot more animals losing their homes, and that also causes an increase in human and animal conflict. We're seeing it in Sri Lanka with elephants and leopards as well. So these are just some of those concepts that we're going to be looking at and we're already experiencing, and they're only going to get worse in the future. So why industrialization plays a key role is this. This is actually a historic evaluation of global surface temperatures. And as you can see from 1860 to 2020, obviously temperatures have kept on increasing. But what you see here in 1950 is when industrialization actually occurred. While there has been an increase in this area, the increase hasn't been as steep. It's been quite steady. But from the 1950s onwards, the increase has been extrapolated and it's huge. So this is going to keep on increasing unless we do something. And obviously, as you can see, it is the industrialization and of course the industrial sector that takes a huge responsibility in helping to change this. So that kind of sets us into what sustainable manufacturing is all about. It's about understanding what your impacts are as an organization, your impacts on the environment and the communities that surround your operations, and how you can use and understand those impacts to develop a more sustainable process for your manufacturing. How can you use more sustainable materials? How can you produce products that are made from sustainable processes and also incorporate more sustainable materials or regenerative materials? And of course, that applies for the services that you may provide as well. So it involves a lot of integrating your knowledge. So you need to understand the kind of resources that you use. How are you using those resources? How efficient can you be or how efficient you are? What kind of digital technologies for monitoring and evaluation are available? And using economic and innovative concepts to really use and change how your process happens. So in my view, and I think it's pretty obvious that the industrial and the manufacturing sector particularly plays a very important role in ensuring that the operations it has a minimal impact on the environment and ensures that it also drives towards more meaningful environmental improvements. In today's context, sustainable manufacturing processes are also aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 goals and all of them are applicable depending on what kind of industry you are, what kind of organization you are, and what kind of operations you run. And they also ensure that they're integrated across your organization. So whether you have offices, factories, service centers, and of course, all of the key stakeholders that you work with. So the first step of understanding how sustainable manufacturing actually works is to understand what your impacts are. And I've taken a very simple general view here. So obviously you're going to be using resources, and that's generally energy and water. You're going to be generating a lot of waste. You'll also use chemicals. If you're in the manufacturing sector, you may use chemicals such as dyes, especially in the apparel sector. You may use paints, solvents. If you're in the agricultural sector, you'll use fertilizers, weedicides, etc. And of course, all of your operations will generate greenhouse gas emissions. So your process in itself will generate greenhouse gas emissions from the fuels that you use, the energy that you're consuming, but also the products that you produce. For example, the waste that's generated will also have an emission impact. You're going to be generating a lot of wastewater, whether it's from domestic usage or from industrial usage as well. And of course, the buildings and the sites that you're having. So your land use, you could be in important important sites, biodiverse sites. So you need to ensure that your operations do not impact those ecosystems as well. So once you understand your impacts, that kind of helps you to evaluate what you need to be doing and how you can mitigate and reduce your impacts. I know there's a lot of aspects here, but it's fairly simple to understand how this can be done. So I've kind of clubbed energy and emissions together because they kind of go hand in hand. So when you think about the energy that we use, and especially in Sri Lanka, it's primarily fossil fuel based. We do have a bit of hydro, and then there are lots of industries who have also turned into solar and wind as well. But how you can be resource efficient and how you can use optimal energy for your operations is through the equipment that you use. And that is actually the most important impact, the way you can mitigate your impact from the energy sector. So you can use energy efficient equipment from the apparel sector. We've used examples such as magnetic bearing chillers, more efficient boilers, a lot of other equipment such as, the sewing machinery that you use. And this is not just relevant just for the apparel sector, but it can be for any other sector that you use. You can use lighting as well. And lighting and cooling are one of the biggest consumers of electricity in a lot of industries. As we go forward, we're also going to be looking at electrifying our transport, because if you're using a lot of fossil fuels and the transport, either whether it's of your goods and services or whether it's your employees or any other form of transport, or if you're in the logistics sector, even for shipping, for example, we're looking at using more carbon-friendly fuels or even electrifying the transport that you use. But of course, that also depends on where that electricity is coming from. So that involves that huge transition towards renewable energy that we really need to be pushing for, not just in Sri Lanka, but globally as well. And I think if you look at, the costs of what renewable energy have become compared to about 15, 20 years ago, it's much more affordable. And the return on interest on that is a lot more feasible as well from an economic perspective. So if you look at water and wastewater, you can obviously use energy efficient water fittings. There are several type categories. There are things like green seal and LEED rated water fittings that are extremely water efficient. And of course, when you're thinking about the wastewater that you generate either from domestic or industrial usage, such as from an effluent treatment plant, you need to ensure that you are treating your wastewater without discharging it completely into river bodies, such as what happens with, the Kalini River especially. You can use ways of recycling the wastewater. For example, there are ways that you can recycle domestic usage back into like flushing, maybe irrigation, gardening, things like that as well. And of course, rainwater harvesting. And considering that we do have quite a few monsoon seasons, I think that's definitely a feasible aspect for us to consider. When we think about wastewater, we also think about a lot of the chemicals that we use, especially now from the apparel industry. There's a lot of dyes, and from even the fabric, the washing, and things like that as well. So there's actually a program called ZDHC, which stands for the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals. It's primarily targeted at the fashion industry, so the textile and the apparel industry. And it looks at about 17 different priority chemicals that include chlorobenzenes, phthalates, such as that. And it also wants to advocate for how we can actually move towards zero discharge of these hazardous chemicals, because they actually cause a lot of pollutant damage across the food chain. So for example, if these kind of chemicals get into the water, you're looking at biomagnification, where, for example, the fish may ingest these, you may eat that fish, and then you are ingested with these chemicals as well. And they're quite dangerous. They can cause cancer, examples like that. Right. So those are the kind of aspects that you will need to look at when you're trying to mitigate your impact. Can you look at more sustainable chemicals, more environmentally friendly chemicals? And I'll use a few examples as we go along the slides, which kind of explain the kind of changes that you may need to make. So obviously, you're going to be generating a lot of waste, and especially in the apparel industry, there's a lot of fabric waste that's generated. Yes, of course, you do have a waste hierarchy. There's the recycle, the reuse, but I think the best way to really mitigate the impact from your waste is to recycle and reuse. And as we move forward into the future, there are aspects such as material circularity that are coming into play. And really interesting example of this where, you know, one person's waste can actually become another industry's resource is the use of, is how they have used tea waste from the tea industry to create a chemical that is used in fabric dyeing. So what's considered waste for the tea industry becomes an input and an important sustainable resource for the apparel industry. And that actually becomes a more sustainable product that you're producing through a sustainable process. So it's a win-win on all sides. And of course, like I mentioned, if you're having, you know, the buildings and the sites that you're, you know, working out of, they have to be sustainable. So you can, while you work on these aspects such as energy, emissions in your water and wastewater and waste, you actually end up developing a sustainable building. So you don't necessarily have to say, you know, I need to do an entirely new process if I want to be a LEED certified process. If you've already looked at these other aspects, you automatically are able to apply for LEED and become a LEED rated building. LEED is not the only one. There's green marks, there's EDGE, there's a lot more other, passive house, for example. They all look at different aspects of a sustainable process. For example, passive house looks at more on the energy efficiency and insulation side of it. And then, of course, you know, the future is net zero. And we're looking at more net zero carbon certified buildings, also embodied carbon, so that the materials that you're using to construct these buildings also come from low carbon sources. But if you're a company that actually operates in rural areas, or you're operating in maybe water scarce regions or areas that are, you know, have a lot of biodiversity, you will obviously be responsible by mitigating your impact through reforestation activities, afforestation. I think the tea plantations industry looks at a lot of these aspects, the agricultural industry. I think even like examples like Haley's, who does a lot of work in, you know, developing the wetlands and conserving the ecosystems around those areas as well. So sustainable products is one other aspect. And I think of sustainable products in actually two different ways. So one is that if you're making a more sustainable manufacturing process, the product that actually comes out of it is actually a sustainable product. So it has low energy or water impact. It you know, doesn't use any harmful chemicals, things like that. But you can also think of more innovative ways of creating a sustainable product. So that's where the circularity comes into play. Can you use organic, for example, in the apparel industry, we'd use organic cotton, or we'd recycle cotton. So we'll do like a mix of maybe 50% recycled cotton, 50% virgin cotton. So those are all sustainable products. You can even think about sustainable packaging, FSC certified wood, corrugated carton that has been recycled from previously used corrugated carton. So actually these options are endless, and there's so many ways of which you can actually make a more sustainable process overall. So I know there's a lot of, I mean, in my previous slide, I did go into a lot of examples about where you would need to invest in more energy efficient technology, more water efficient technology, but that's actually not always the case. There will definitely be investment, but it doesn't mean that it's a very expensive process overall. There's a lot of examples where the investment has actually paid off over time, not in a very long period of time, sometimes 2 to 3 years, 3 to 4 years. And while it may seem as a longer time, if you look at what it was like previous years, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it's a much better environment today. So before I go into the barriers about why a lot of companies hesitate about getting into sustainable manufacturing, let me just show you why it's important to get into it. And this is what I really call, as opposed to advantages, I'd call them value additions. So if you're thinking about a more efficient process where you're reducing the energy and the water that you're using, and you're actually generating value from the waste that you generate, you're actually increasing operational efficiency and thereby becoming a more cost-efficient process. You're only spending money on the actual energy and water that you're using, and you're earning money from your waste. Sustainable processors, or companies that follow sustainable manufacturing processes or create products out of sustainable processes, are able to actually reach new customer bases. If you look at customers in the in the EU, in the UK, in the USA, there's a lot of people especially from a regulatory perspective as well. The EU is also looking at more regulations to push companies or the manufacturing sector that they source from to be from a more sustainable process. So that also gives you a more competitive advantage over your other competitors. Maybe you can reach new markets, you can reach more customers, and of course that enhances your business performance. It also increases brand reputation, because if you're a company that actually does follow sustainable processes in terms of mitigating its impact on the environment, providing sustainable development solutions in the communities that you're operating in, of course, using an ethical labor workforce and supply chain, you're actually building and strengthening your brand reputation. Again, that also reaches new customers, and then it also gives you increased public trust, because people, they know that you are, you're the real deal. It also builds long-term business viability. There's a lot of research that has shown that business performance has increased not just in the short term but in the long term as well. So it's a win-win overall. If you really think about sustainability, a lot of people think about it from a more marketing perspective, or maybe it increases, it adds to your risk and compliance perspective. And it's actually all of that. If you think about how your operations should run, it's about that impact that you have and ensuring that that impact is minimal, so that you can continue to keep using those resources and creating products in the future. Because if we're going to run out of resources, then there is no manufacturing sector. Another value addition, and I think is becoming largely important today, and especially not just in the apparel sector, is supply chain transparency. How can we track the goods that we produce right along its supply chain, especially when parts of that product are created in different markets in different areas, so that the customer who buys that product or service understands where it's come from, and is able to understand what kind of impact it has had on the environment, so that increases purchasing power. So the barriers, like I mentioned, a lot of companies are hesitant to get into this because of economic and financial misconceptions. So they think it's all just about investment, and it's going to use up a lot of capital expenditure. That's not so, because you actually have a lot of cost savings in terms of that. So an example of this is now during COVID in 2020, Ghana had to build this infectious diseases hospital, and they actually worked with IFC to do so. Within a year, they went for a very sustainable process. And of course, this is in manufacturing, but it's a good example of the kind of impact that you can have. So through IFC, they got a loan. They actually went in for this. And within a year, they have achieved 40% operational cost savings. And that's not just for the hospital, that is applicable for any company that really looks at a more sustainable manufacturing process. Another barrier that is very common is also inadequate systems for monitoring and evaluation. Key to sustainability is data. How can you use the data that you generate? How can you improve on that data? How can you evaluate that data? And how can you manage that data to increase your performance and build a better process? And another problem is lack of expertise. So that's why I said I think a lot of companies look at sustainability in different ways. But I think sustainability is not just something that, is a far-fetched fairy tale. It is here to stay. And this is really the only way that we can, run a process that helps. So on your, on the right-hand side, you can actually see this graph. So this is some research by McKinsey that evaluates data over a period of maybe 10 years. And as you can see, there's a lot of increases. As you can see, it opens up a lot of new growth opportunities. It meets a lot of society's expectations for good corporate behavior. So that means public reputation, brand reputation as well. It's improving your operational efficiency and decreasing costs, and improving your risk management as well. And of course, strengthening the organization's competitive position. So like I said, when people see that you're, coming from a sustainable process, they automatically want to give you those opportunities to be part of their process as well. So an example that I would like to give is, like, for example, if you look at Schneider. So Schneider is well known globally for electrical equipment. But what they have moved in over the last few years is into providing efficiency as a service. So the more efficient the service becomes, or the equipment and technology that they provide. So for example, they even do IoT services such as, energy efficient building management systems, tracking systems, things like that as well. So the more they're able to provide through energy efficient savings for their customers, the more their revenue increases and the more they're able to expand into global markets. And that's really the power of, what sustainable manufacturing is all about. So if we think about all of these aspects of sustainability, energy, emissions, water, that's going to continue into the future for as far as we can imagine. And that's really the general base of what sustainability or sustainable manufacturing is all about. But there's a lot more concepts that are coming up, and this is really what the future of sustainability looks like. And in my opinion, these are the top 4 trends that I see that we're looking at as a transition. So I always think that sustainable manufacturing or sustainable process doesn't happen overnight. You have to build into that over time. You start with the small aspects, and you build into the large aspects, and you see that impact over time, and it is massive. So the transition to net zero is here to stay, and this is one of the bigger things that we're looking at, especially if we want to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot of international advocations for this as well. So we're looking at the World Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero. So that actually looks at ensuring your buildings are as energy efficient as possible, and any remaining energy that you're using comes from on-site renewable energy sources. I think in Sri Lanka, we are very proud to say that we have the world's first net zero apparel manufacturing facility. And I think, as we look forward, there are a lot more companies that are pushing towards net zero, especially through SBTi as well. So these aspects we will have to consider. And if we think about the future, especially from a regulatory framework, especially from the EU and the US, there's a lot of push into these areas. So we can't really say, okay, this is, too far, this is not acceptable to us right now. We can't really move into this. Few years down the road, it's going to be mandatory. So unless you make the changes now, it's going to be extremely harder as you go along. You'll probably be taxed extremely difficultly as well. For example, now Singapore is already changing its carbon tax from $30 to $80, $50 to $80, and earlier they were expecting it to be from $10 to $12. So that's a huge difference there alone. So the other two aspects, such as material circularity and digital technology, I'll actually go into in the next couple of slides. Again, like I mentioned about sustainable products, so if you can see those few little icons at the bottom, so it also there indicates low energy and water consumption processes. It already creates a sustainable product. Whether you have sustainability management systems such as building management systems, even ISO 5001 systems, whether you're using materials that are come from recycled sources. So even if it's, if I'm talking about from the apparel industry, so, recycled cotton, recycled nylon, things like that. Processes without hazardous chemicals, again, aspects such as ZDHC. And also traditional materials with low environmental impact. So we're talking about materials such as organic cotton. There's a lot of research that has been made in the apparel sector, especially for materials that are made from bio-based sources. So for example, from fungi like mushrooms, for example. Ethical practices along the supply chain. So whether you're taking care of your labor workforce, how you're taking care of your supply chain, your impacts on the communities that you work in as well, how are you taking care of them? And of course, materials from responsibly managed forests. So I think especially from like the paper and the packaging that you may use, are you using FSC certified wood? Are you recycling the cardboard and paper that you use? Is it coming back into your processes? So again, that goes back into circular economy as well. So circular economy actually, if you think about it in hindsight, in certain ways we have been doing, if we think about ourselves as individuals, our old clothes, either we use it as rags in the kitchen or, as rugs on the floor or, something like that. At least we give it a second life. So we've been doing it for years, but it's not obviously across the board. There's a lot of waste that's generated from the manufacturing side of it as well as from the consumer side of it. So how can we really mitigate that impact through reducing the waste or reducing that impact of the waste on the environment? We can't keep landfilling forever. That goes into another, greenhouse gas emission, because that generates a lot of methane, and methane is actually a lot more dangerous for the atmosphere than carbon dioxide is. So how can we take our waste, use it as a raw material and put it back as, redesigning it, upcycling it? How can we put it back into our process through a re-engineered process, create a different product for it, create a new market for it, and it goes on and on. So it's actually it's an endless loop. And this is really a very important thing. And like I mentioned before, so how the waste from the tea industry became a dye for the apparel industry, and that becomes a sustainable product. You're actually reducing the impact on the environment because you're minimizing the waste from one industry, and you're using a more sustainable chemical for the production of a new product. So circular economy obviously has a lot of benefits. The most obvious is waste prevention, but it also reduces pressure on the environment because you're reducing the amount of resources that you really need to take in back again for a new product. But also because you're minimizing waste, the impact of emissions from that waste is also reduced on the environment. You're improving the security of the supply of raw materials because you already know where the new raw materials are coming from because they're part of your waste. And this increases competitiveness and stimulates innovation, because when you're trying to think about ways about, using your waste and re-engineering it and putting it back into your production process, you're stimulating an innovation culture within your organization. You don't necessarily have to do the innovation in-house, but you can work in collaboration with a lot of, research organizations, with other organizations within the industry, or, any other part of the manufacturing industry. And that creates those important collaborations and partnerships that you work together to create that sustainable process for the industrial sector overall. And increasing competitiveness is an important aspect. So for example, if you think about in the apparel sector, if there's, say we have apparel manufacturing in Sri Lanka and apparel manufacturing in India, and there's a company in India that can create a product for this specific customer, let's say, I don't know, Victoria's Secrets, and it can create a product from 50% using 50% recycled material. Now, if that company in Sri Lanka is unable to put that same kind of product on the market, then of course, Victoria's Secrets is going to take the production to India. So we're going to lose not just our economic development, as well as, loss of jobs and things like that. So in order to ensure that we retain those benefits of, developing our economy, because we are reliant on the manufacturing sector, we have to be competitive. We have to start thinking about more innovative ways of, creating new sustainable products. And it can also boost, obviously, like economic growth and create new jobs. For example, the EU estimates that by 2030, if they push towards a more circular economy in different areas of the industrial sector, they're looking at a 1% increase in their GDP and also about 700,000 new jobs just by 2030 alone. And that's only a very, very small estimate. So they're thinking that that could be huger as we go along into the future. So if we think about all of the impacts that we have, we need to understand how we ensure we mitigate those impacts, because we're going to have to analyze a lot of data. And that is where really digital technology comes into play. So if you take any organization, whether you're in the manufacturing sector or otherwise, you're going to accumulate a large set of data, especially on environmental KPIs, how much energy you're using, how much water you're using, where is that energy being used, where is the water being used. And it is extremely important to understand how you can analyze this data to be able to improve your process. So you can identify your consumption patterns, how are you deviating on your usage or efficiencies, calculate an environmental footprint. You can make it carbon, water, or waste, whatever you want. And that obviously then leads to improved environmental performance because you're optimizing your resources, which leads to cost-effective operations. You're improving your processes, you're standardizing better. It helps with your ESG reporting, and it helps you identify your impacts on the supply chain. So if you push your supply chain partners also to use that data, it's vast. like I mentioned already, cost savings through resource efficiency and a lot of innovation. Because if you're using your data to mitigate your impact, then you're being forced to take more innovative measures to change your process. So this is actually this is an analysis that was done by the Boston Consulting Group, and how they kind of foresee how digital technology is really going to impact us in the future, if not already. And I think with COVID, we've seen a lot more acceleration with regards to digital technology. So this is really the way forward. So if you digitize your operations, if you think about creating more sustainable operations and processes, you're creating more competitiveness within your industry, you're building brand reputation. They eventually become industry standards or benchmarks, and that improves your business resilience because your customers are going to see that and they're going to want to keep working with you for manufacturing, for example. And they've used here is textile dyeing, for example. If your textile dyeing process actually uses less water, energy, and the chemicals that you're using are coming from sustainable sources such as the tea industry, and it's reducing the emissions you generate, there's no way they're going to move away from you and go to someone else, unless of course someone does something better. But that keeps that competitiveness going. So these are the other aspects. If you look at digital products and services, I think this helped us during COVID, but it happened some years before, at least a couple of years before COVID. So in the apparel industry, they're now moving towards 3D modeling. So previously, if you are designing a garment for the customer, you would actually design it in-house, and then you would send it or air freight it or ship it to wherever the customer is, so that they can evaluate whether this is in line with what they want, etc., things like that. But now they're using 3D modeling to actually do that. So you're actually saving on the energy and the water and other environmental impacts that would go into creating a sample garment, but also the logistics that involves it. The either shipping or digital, or at least your air freight is also removed from it, and you actually can look at this in real time. You can discuss with your customer in real time. You can look at it the same way, and find different ways to do this. And of course, this is more affordable as well. Yes, of course, you'll have some costs that will come in implementing the new processes. But if you look at overweighing, if you evaluate it, it overweighs it. A lot of companies are looking at ways of how IoT and blockchain technology can really use the tracking of environmental and societal impacts. So labor and things like that across your value chain. So whether you can track all of your impacts about the products that you're producing across your supply chain, and that helps you make more informed decisions and increase the impact that you have to a more positive side. Artificial intelligence and advanced analytics, with the amount of data that you're having, how can you use this data to make better choices or more informed choices? For example, if you're using real-time monitoring systems for your equipment, can you maybe improve on its maintenance, keep it more operational over a longer period of time? And that also kind of engages customers, such as what Schneider did as well. Data sharing and ecosystems, with the amount of data that's generated, how can you work together with other organizations within the industrial sector, within the services industries as well, to see whether, what your problem could have a solution from another industry, or, whether their problems are your problems, and how can you really work together to really overcome this and create a more sustainable process overall. And this is really a win-win overall for everyone. So there's a lot of intelligent solutions that you can use. Obviously, building management systems, they actually use real-time data monitoring. You can control your system, such as your cooling, your electricity, your lighting, through sensors. You can maintain the carbon dioxide and energy levels within your facility, whether it's a factory or whether it's an office. You maintain ambient working environments for your employees, indoor air quality impacts, all of that can be monitored. And of course, if you're going in for solar, there's a lot of, all of your solar now comes with real-time solar monitoring as well. Includes all of the troubleshooting, your power consumption, weather patterns, everything's built into the system. So you have absolutely no manual work here. And it allows you to make a lot more informed decisions as well. So while we did look at internal governance tools, there's a lot of external governance as well. And I'm not going into all of this. And this is by far not an exhaustive list of everything that's available. This is a lot more related to the apparel industry, but there's a lot that can be taken into other manufacturing sectors as well. You have green buildings such as the USGBC for LEED, RAP, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is actually a platform that monitors data across the entire apparel industry, not just within Sri Lanka, across other companies as well, so that, the customers or, the relevant stakeholders can actually evaluate all of the factories against, a similar kind of standardized measuring or monitoring system. Partnerships with IUCN, the Sustainable Development Goals, ISO obviously, and then of course there's the UNGC, the principles of the UNGC as well. So two things that I would really like to highlight is Certified B Corp and the Alliance for Water Stewardship. The manufacturing sector, especially in the apparel sector, we do use a lot of water for the dyeing process, the washing process, especially in the textile manufacturing process. So the Alliance for Water Stewardship actually looks at companies that are using water stewardship activities, not just within their processes, but how they impact in the communities that they work in. Are they helping the communities that they work in, solve their water related problems, whether the ecosystems or, the biodiverse sites that they use in are also taken into account. And Certified B Corp is actually the next level of what I would say kind of brand visibility for a manufacturing or any organization for that matter. So it takes into account all of your environmental and social impacts and tries to see how you fare on all of them, whether you're taking care of your environment, you're taking care of the people that you work with or the people in the communities that you work with. And then, it helps you to understand how you can improve on this and how you can compare with other companies as well. It's quite stringent, but I think as we go into the future, this is going to be another sort of maybe benchmark for companies to look at from a sustainability perspective. So this is actually quite an interesting exercise. This is actually a simulator model that was developed by MIT. It's called the En-ROADS Climate Solution Simulator, and I will drop the link into the chat box later. So what it looks at is, if you think about greenhouse gas emissions and business as usual scenario, we're looking at a 3.6 degree rise in global temperatures. And what this simulator has done is it has looked at 18 different variables. So across the energy supply, carbon taxing, transport and the buildings, and of course your land and industry emissions and carbon removal parameters. And it looks at how you can actually play around with these parameters. And I'll show you in the next slide how you can do so. And while it looks at growth, if you think about, if you click on this, you can go and actually see. So the UN actually estimates the population of the world at 2100 to be about 11 billion people, and the economic growth to be about 2.5% on average as well. So this is just to show you how the simulation works. So I've actually pulled in a few parameters. You can go in and play around with, it in different ways. So I've like I said, if you look in the future, all of the fossil fuels are going to be extremely highly taxed, and there's going to be a carbon price on it. So unless you actually make that transition into renewables, into a more net zero future, then you're going to be paying a lot of money on your fossil fuels. So I've just played around with some of the parameters here, and what I really wanted to show is this is what it looks like if you are to make a change for a sustainable future. There is no one solution that is going to be the only way to achieve it. It's going to take everything that we can possibly do. Every company, every organization, every country making a decision to make a change for a sustainable future. Otherwise, that temperature is not coming down. So as you can see here, I've just only played with a few and it's only come down to 2.7. That's still about 1.2 degrees away from the 1.5 degree benchmark that we need to reach. But this comes down to 1, and that means that all of the fossil fuels will be very highly taxed. Carbon pricing is going to be huge. We need to be moving into bioenergy, renewables. Energy efficiency has to be maximum for the transport sector, for your buildings, for your industry. And we need to be moving into electrification for your transport and the buildings, but that also means that electricity comes from renewable sources as opposed to fossil fuels. And if you really think from the land and the industry emissions, so for example, agriculture, plantations for Sri Lanka, deforestation is going to have to be extremely minimal. And methane and other emissions is because, if we are looking at reduced deforestation, so that means methane emissions will be lowered. That means landfilling has to be zero as well. And we're looking at a lot more afforestation and technological improvements for carbon removal. So I've not played with two parameters here, and that's, nuclear and new zero carbon. So according to the system, what new zero carbon means is that it's this amazing new technology that is going to be groundbreaking, come in and change everything. But what scientists think right now is that it's too late for such a groundbreaking tech. For one, is the groundbreaking technology has not been really established. And they think that it's far too late now for that groundbreaking technology to come in and change the face of this earth, because by the time it gets stabilized, it might already be too late. So that means we need to be doing everything else. And I'm not the biggest fan of nuclear because, for one, well, nuclear safety is a problem. And then there's a huge load of radioactive waste that stays radioactive for, thousands of years. But as you can see here, it really is going to take everything that we have if we want to keep temperature below. And of course, we do have to reach 1.5, but I think reaching to 1 gives us a bit of leverage to play around as well. But this is just a pretty grim view of everything that we need to do. And as you can see here, from 2020, which is really where we are, to 2100, we need to start the transition now if we are going to get to this. Otherwise, it's never going to get to that point at all. So that's pretty much what I really wanted to take you all through on sustainable processors.
So thank you very much, Ms. Nadia, for that interesting and knowledgeable session. So